People often ask me, like, what's the best way to treat cancer? I say, well, the best way is not to get it in the first place. Cancer is an inflammatory disease, and even like moles and things are tumors.
Dr. David Harper.
He's an expert in cancer research and the author of the Bio Diet. He knows the cause of cancer and how you can prevent it.
And it starts with your mitochondria.
Typically, cancers, no matter where they start, will spread to the liver, lungs, and brain, and that becomes terminal cancer. The cells develop abnormally, probably 2 or 3 times a day. If you think of what cancer cells need to grow, we mentioned the fact that they're anaerobic, so they need glucose. So glucose is sugar. And where does sugar come from? Carbohydrates. So you tell people, oh, you should eat a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Well, the cancer cells love that. We didn't evolve on, nor are we adapted for a high-carb diet. That's completely artificial, and it was completely wrong when they suggested it. We're actually evolved and developed for a high-fat diet, because if we could just get people to eat less sugar, to not eat processed food, just get people back eating grass-fed butter, we could probably reduce the incidence of chronic disease by about 70%. There's no drugs that do that. But there is a simple lifestyle change. mTOR is a good thing. It promotes growth and, regeneration, repair of tissues, growth when we're younger and so on. But too much of it, and you start enhancing the growth of things you don't want to grow, like cancer cells.
What do you think about sunscreen and people want to slip, stop, slap? The chemicals in sunscreen, does that have any effect on inflammatory markers at all?
Yeah, well, there's some they banned now, right?
This episode with Dr. David Harper will change the way that you think about cancer. Many of us think that cancer is inevitable, but Dr. David Harper will share the simple science of how cancer starts, but most importantly, how you can prevent cancer with what you eat. Now, this information is not what you're going to hear from Big Food or Big Pharma. So if you're learning from and enjoying these free episodes, please hit the subscribe button, because 81% of you who watch these episodes regularly have not subscribed. And by the simple act of subscribing, you can help share this message to millions more people that need to hear it. And now for the episode with Dr. David Harper. Dr. Harper, welcome.
Thanks for having me on your show. It's a pleasure, and it's nice to meet you sort of in person.
Now, when many people think about cancer, they think of the fear of impending death. And most people will think it's pretty random if I get cancer. But cancer is fast becoming the #1 killer behind heart disease. So it's not random, and it can happen to any of us. And 100 years ago, we had the answer to how cancer starts and grows, and a possible answer to how to prevent cancer. But the thing is, it's still not in the mainstream. So today, Dr. David Harper is going to share his extensive research and experience in cancer. He's going to talk about how you can prevent cancer and how cancer starts and grows in the body. So Dr. Harper, my first question. If somebody has just clicked on this video and they're thinking, there is no way I'm going to get cancer, it's highly unlikely. How likely is it that somebody is going to get some type of cancer?
Well, before I answer that, I just want to point out that, despite the doctor, I'm an academic. I'm not a physician. So I provide sort of health advice and an understanding of the science that underlies the medical community. But I'm not a physician, and I'm not an oncologist. I'm a nutrition researcher, and I come to it from that perspective. As a lifelong teacher of health and wellness as well. I've been doing that for more than 40 years. So to answer your question, I'm going to ask you a question is how often during the average person's life do you think they actually get metastatic cancer, the kinds of cells that could become a tumor and could become life-threatening? How many times during an average, if somebody lives, say, 85 years, how many times do you think they might develop cancer?
I think it could happen quite often, probably daily.
Yeah, and that's what surprises people. People say, "Oh, well, so and so got cancer when they're in their 80s or whatever." So, but the cells develop abnormally on a daily basis, probably 2 or 3 times a day, not 2 or 3 times a lifetime. And of course, it's our immune system that is designed to detect those cells and destroy them before they can grow to the point where they would become life-threatening, where they can spread, which we call metastasis, and then be potentially life-threatening. So it is also, there is some random element to it, because there are certainly genetic factors that predispose you. There are some cancers, like there's the BRCA gene for BRCA1, BRCA2 for breast cancer. That gives you a much higher likelihood of developing those cancers. So there is some sort of randomness and some genetics to it. And then there's also exposure to environmental elements, and you're not necessarily aware of how much exposure you've had. So even background radiation causes that. So, and our cells just naturally, some of them go haywire and the wrong genes get turned on. We call those oncogenes. Onco is the sort of Greek for crab, which is cancer is the Latin for crab, because the tumors kind of look like crabs. They have these tendrils that sort of come out, and that's the difference between metastatic tumor that's life-threatening and a benign tumor, which is much more like just a lump that's well-defined. So we need to differentiate between tumors, and even like moles and things are tumors, and then potentially cancerous tumors or metastatic tumors, which are a different type of cell type, and those cells are driven towards growth and reproduction. That's all. They don't perform the normal functions of other cells, and therefore they take over the life affirming functions of those tissues, and they can eventually spread. Typically cancers, no matter where they start, solid tumors at least, will spread to the liver, lungs, and brain if they're unchecked, and that becomes terminal cancer. But then there's two sort of general types: the solid tumors, which are lumps and bumps and things. And then there's the fluid tumors, which are the leukemias and lymphomas that occur in the blood and the lymph system.
Absolutely. So it's important to understand that when we say the term cancer, it's an umbrella term that means a lot of different types of cancer. I'm sure that many of you have heard of breast cancer, prostate cancer, lung cancer, skin cancer. These are types of carcinoma cancers. Is that correct?
Yeah, and that's the tissue type. So the generally cancers tend to grow in epithelial tissues. There's 4 tissue types. There's muscle, nerve, connective tissue, and epithelial tissue. And so epithelium forms skin, which is why we get skin cancer, but it also lines all of the other organs. And one branch of epithelium forms the glandular tissue. So for instance, in glandular tissue, they tend to be called adenomas. So yes, you're right. And then sarcomas if they're in muscles, and osteomas in bone. So that if you see oma at the end of a condition, that's probably a tumor of some sort. And yeah, so the cell type is important. There's probably 200 or more different types of cancer. It depends on the tissue type, the cell type, and then also we're learning more and more about these subtypes of each type of cancer as we move towards personalized genetic treatments for tumors. So they can identify the specific cell type you have, identify differences between those cells and your healthy normal cells, and then prescribe a treatment that takes advantage of that difference to selectively kill the cancer cells without harming the other tissues. So that's the sort of modern oncogenetic approach to treating cancers, and very effective, very expensive, by the way. Some of these immunotherapies can be $1 million per patient, so they're clearly not yet for everyone. And so, people often ask me, like, what's the best way to treat cancer? I say, well, the best way is not to get it in the first place, because if you can avoid getting it, then you don't have to make all those life-changing decisions you'll need to make if you have to go through radiation therapy, surgery, or the chemotherapies that they're using nowadays. But I have to say, in my lifetime, certainly it's come a long way. My mother died when I was 9, just turning 10. And this is in Montreal, and she was one of the first people to undergo the cobalt radiation treatment. And in those days, they just had some radioactive cobalt in like a lead box, and they'd sort of run out of the room and open the box, and it would just irradiate her chest and just destroy all the tissue there. It was very, very crude. Nowadays, they have things like intensity modulated radiation therapy, which triangulates, and you go in for a few minutes every day for a couple of weeks, and the symptoms are obviously much less, and there's still some side effects, but very good at targeting cancer. As I said, the chemotherapies, the new immunotherapies and targeted chemotherapies and CAR T, and these are very, very sexy and effective. But those new therapies are based on the notion that cancer is fundamentally a genetic thing. These genes get turned on that drive the cells towards abnormal growth, and turn normal healthy cells into rapidly dividing cancer cells. And from that approach, you can identify thousands of possible therapeutic pathways. These are the metabolic pathways within the cells that are triggered by those cancer-causing genes, the oncogenes. And you know, we developed these very effective therapies for many people, but the problem is the cancer cells reproduce so quickly, they adapt to all these new drugs. And I shouldn't say all of them, but the drugs and the treatments, they're very adaptable because our cells are naturally adaptable. So when you were talking about 100 years ago, the way we initially thought of cancer was more of a metabolic disease. And if you look at it as a metabolic disease, one of the key things that was identified by a fellow named Otto Warburg in the 30s, which he won the Nobel Prize for, was that cancer cells tend to be, not all of them, but they tend to be biased towards anaerobic respiration. So in other words, they can't use fats and glucose and so on in a normal, efficient way to produce the energy they need for that growth and reproduction. They actually are shifted towards anaerobic respiration. And, you know, the Olympics are on now. So anaerobic is all those sprinting, jumping kind of things, whereas the aerobic is the long distance, long swimming, long running sort of events. So they turn into these sort of sprinter cells, if you like. And they're very dependent on glucose. And because they're growing, they're also very dependent on growth factors. There's growth hormone, but insulin is a very important growth factor. So that's probably where we can take this conversation, is looking at cancer cells from a metabolic perspective and their dependence on anaerobic respiration and their dependence on glucose as a fuel source for that growth and reproduction.
Absolutely. I just wanted to mention, when I mentioned earlier, the 4 or 5 main groups of cancer, just in case people are wondering what else is there apart from carcinoma and sarcoma. There's also leukemia, lymphoma, and also brain and spinal cord cancer. So glioblastoma. These are all extremely, some of them are very fatal types of cancer, like glioblastoma. The death rate of a glioblastoma, which is cancer in the brain, is 1 year. So within 1 year, most people will die because we don't have interventions for surgery or prevention in the brain. Is that correct?
Yes. Yeah. Sorry, I should have completed. Thank you for doing that for me. Oh, that's good. Yes. So there's the glial cells are support cells in the nervous system. So they're nerve tissue. So that's GBMs, we call them. Glioblastoma multiforme is a very poor prognosis type of brain tumor. There's also benign brain tumors, but they can still be problematic because they're actually compressing the brain tissue and interfering with that. So they often have to be removed, but it's easier to remove them because they're well defined. Whereas if you have a cancerous, a malignant tumor like a GBM, it's that cancer, it's those tendrils there that make it virtually impossible to treat surgically. So then really your only hope is somehow sort of a metabolic approach. They've also used some barometric chambers, putting people in oxygen chambers under high pressure, and that associated with some chemotherapy seems to be also a way to treat them, but really, really hard to treat. And as you say, the prognosis is typically about a year. And since you're in Calgary and I'm in Canada, people in Canada will know about Gord Downie, who is, Tragically Hip, the lead singer for the Tragically Hip, a very big, probably one of the best Canadian bands ever. And he died of a GBM, glioblastoma multiforme, sadly, a few years ago. Now, my area of research, ketogenic nutrition, that has also been used because it has a metabolic approach to treat very few cases. So this is all anecdotal of GBMs, and had some success with that. And I say that when we start talking about treatments for using nutritional approaches and metabolic approaches, I really want to emphasize to your listeners that like a ketogenic diet is not a cure for cancer. It seems to be an effective adjunct treatment along with the standard of care. So if you have been diagnosed with cancer, please continue to take the advice of your physicians and your oncologist and so on. And you might want to consider also adopting a ketogenic diet, which could have some. We've found some anecdotal evidence that it has good therapeutic value. We can talk about the reason for that. And then the preventative possibilities there, that's sort of a different story, because then you're looking at large populations of people and so on. And I don't think we can say conclusively that a ketogenic diet will prevent cancer. And because you'd have to take 30,000 people and put all of them on a standard diet and another half of them on a ketogenic diet and follow them for 30 years and see the rate at which they develop tumors. And there's just that there's no way to control that experiment because everybody has to eat. And so what we can do is look at using things like ketogenic diets and other metabolic therapies to treat cancers that are there. And the same principles would imply that if they're good at reducing tumor size and reducing the rate of growth of tumors, then it should also be effective at reducing the incidence of cancer. So incidence is the rate at which the population gets the disease. Prevalence is how much disease there is. And as you said quite correctly at the beginning, after cardiovascular disease or heart disease, cancer is the number 2 cause of mortality. So it is a very serious condition to be treated and to look at always. And so what we're finding is both approaches is best. You could use a metabolic approach along with the standard of care. That gives you your best outcome as far as treatment for cancer.
Absolutely. We're going to talk about the metabolic therapy to help treat cancer. Again, all this is in adjunct to a standard of care therapy. I wanted to ask you a question going back to the different types of cancer. There is a reason why I asked that question, because a lot of people think that if they get some sort of disease, whether that be cancer, brain disease, Alzheimer's, dementia, or even different types of cancer, do you think they all have the same cause of or etiology?
That's a really good question, Rena. I think there are some root causes to chronic disease. So when we look at disease from a medical approach, we have signs and symptoms, and then we define it as diabetes, or we define it as cardiovascular disease, and we define it as cancer. And so cancer has tumors. Cardiovascular disease affects the heart and the blood vessels. Diabetes generally affects your metabolism, the way your pancreas and your liver are functioning. And so what we want to look at is, are there themes, if you like, that are common to all chronic diseases? So if we look at the 2 types of disease, there's acute diseases, which are like infections and things like that. COVID would be one of those. And then there's chronic diseases, which are ones that develop slowly over time. And it's the chronic diseases that tend to cause most of the mortality and morbidity or decrease in quality of life towards the end of your lives. And that's also really expensive to treat. So if we look at our public healthcare systems, almost, well, I wouldn't say all of it, but an awful lot of it is directed towards treating the effects of chronic disease. So that would be cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, Alzheimer's and neurological disorders. Those would be the main ones. And if you look at the lifestyle factors and then the metabolic factors that relate to those, for instance, with cancer, after whatever genetic cards you're dealt, obviously smoking is a big thing, because most lung cancers, about 7 out of 8, are associated with smoking. So if you don't smoke, you really reduce your risk of lung cancer. And then if we look at the root causes of all those diseases, you keep seeing the same things come up again. So with cancer, you also see obesity as the second most common or the most important lifestyle factor. After smoking is obesity. If you look at obesity, it also affects your rate of cardiovascular disease. So, obesity or excess body fat will correlate very strongly with that. It also correlates very strongly with diabetes. And it also correlates very strongly with Alzheimer's. So you go, well, what is it about obesity that's common to all of these? And you'll see these 3 factors that come up time and time again. And the folks at home can Google, like, what percentage of chronic disease is related to obesity? And it'll come out about 70% of all chronic disease is related to obesity. And then you look at inflammation as the second one, chronic systemic inflammation. So when you get an injury, obviously you get inflammation, the redness, heat, pain, swelling that are the cardinal signs of inflammation. But this is systemic inflammation. So your body is inflamed. There are these chemical signals called cytokines and chemokines that are causing tissues to become irritated, like when you get an inflammation and things. But it's like if the internal blood vessels are irritated like that, then your likelihood of getting cardiovascular disease is much, much greater. In fact, I would say that's the main cause of cardiovascular disease, the atheromas of atheroscleroma, and of coronary heart disease and strokes is due to these buildups of plaques. And that's not due to fat in your diet. That's due to inflammation in your blood vessels. So that's another 70% of all those chronic disease. Alzheimer's is an inflammatory disease. Cancer is an inflammatory disease. Cardiovascular diabetes too causes inflammation. And then the third part of that, again, you see how much of chronic disease is related to insulin resistance. So insulin is a very important growth promoter. Most people think of it as the hormone that takes blood sugar out of your blood and puts it in your muscle cells and your fat cells, and it does that. But it's also a very powerful growth factor too. So it's important for protein synthesis and growth. So if you look at all three of those things, they all come out with this number of about 70% of all chronic disease. So I think in my book, Bio-Diet, I mentioned, if you look at the root cause of most chronic disease, I call it the axis of illness. Remember that axis of evil that George Bush 1 had or whatever? So this is the axis of illness, which is inflammation and obesity and insulin resistance in a little triangle. And what's also interesting further is not only are those three associated with chronic disease, we can demonstrate the mechanisms by which each of those causes the chronic disease. So it's not just a correlational thing, like people say, well, if you eat too much of this, you're going to get this disease. That's just epidemiology. It's correlational. It's not causation. We can show the causes, how each of these three factors, insulin resistance, obesity, and inflammation, cause that chronic disease. And then further to that is they all make each other worse. So inflammation makes obesity worse, makes insulin resistance worse, insulin resistance makes inflammation worse, and so on. So you have this, once you get this started, this axis of illness, it just keeps making itself worse and worse until eventually it begins to express itself as a chronic disease. So your blood sugar gets to a certain point where we say, okay, it's above this level, now you have diabetes. We look at your blood vessels and your blood pressure and things like that, and we can do calcium scores and so on, and angiograms to see how your blood vessels, and we can say, yes, you now have cardiovascular disease. Or we can see the presence of tumors and look for tumor markers and say, yes, now you have cancer. But these are just sort of somewhat arbitrary definitions. And I don't say that to be disrespectful to the medical community. What I mean is you're seeing something as a symptom of something that is happening at the cellular level, which has to do with inflammation, insulin resistance, and obesity at the systemic level. So then we go into the individual cells and we ask ourselves, well, what's changing about these cells that turn them from healthy cells into sick cells? And what's really interesting is it's the only mechanism I've ever seen where both neurological disorders, like, you could include Alzheimer's in there, but Parkinson's and other neurological disorders, even autism to some degree, seem to relate back to what's happening at the cellular level. And then all these metabolic diseases that we mentioned also relate back to the cellular level. And it's the mitochondria within the cells that seem to be disrupted. Now, for those that, forgotten their grade 9 biology or whatever, the mitochondria, I hate it when they say they're the powerhouse of the cell. They're really almost like a symbiotic bacteria that joined way back in evolutionary history, joined into our modern cell types for all, plants, animals, and so on. But in our bodies, they are the primary energy converters. So they take food, break it down, or it's broken down the digestive system, it's absorbed and it's broken down further to release the energy in those carbon-hydrogen bonds for the most part that fuel, that power our body, that allow our bodies to rebuild itself, the anabolic reactions, and allow our bodies to perform all the functions and movements. Like I am waving my hands around because I'm part Italian, so I have to do that. But that requires energy at the cellular level. Now, if those mitochondria are healthy, and you can see healthy and unhealthy mitochondria. If they're unhealthy, you'll see something called senescence. They become kind of fat and clumsy, and they start releasing chemicals within the cells that are harmful and disruptive and disrupt chromosomes and cause the expression of different proteins that lead to illness. And that's a condition called senescence. They get kind of old and they will eventually get worn out and eaten up, but they can do a lot of damage before then. So what you want them to do is be really healthy. And the way you make your mitochondria healthy is really two ways, is through good nutrition and through exercise. Exercise is really good to make healthy mitochondria. That's why those two things, along with sleep and stress management, so on, food and exercise are so important for a healthy lifestyle. And so what we're doing now by addressing this, we're addressing the root cause. We're addressing the inflammation, insulin resistance, and obesity.
As Dr. Harper mentions, cancer and so many other chronic health conditions come from mitochondrial dysfunction. And later in the episode, Dr. Harper will talk more about nutritional protocols to help improve your mitochondria. And one is the ketogenic diet. But I do want to point out that diet is just one part of overall health. Light therapy, specifically red light therapy, has been shown to improve your cell's mitochondria. Now, what red light therapy does is that it penetrates several millimeters into the tissue and it helps with energy production. It reduces oxidative stress and inflammation and also improves your cell's repair system. Now, what this means for you is better sleep, improved recovery, and also skin health. Now, you can do this quite naturally. You can go out and expose yourself to sunlight, especially in the morning. But I do realize that many of you might not have access to sunlight exposure. It could be due to your work schedules or maybe where you live. And that's why investing in a red light therapy device might be beneficial. And that's why I have BondCharge as a sponsor of today's video. BondCharge produces high quality red light therapy devices with bioactive frequencies of red and near infrared light at 660 nanometers to 850 nanometers. Now, I like to use this mini red light therapy device from BondCharge because I travel quite a lot. And if you're super keen on improving your health, you also need to think about blue light. Now, I'm sure that many of you spend a decent amount of time on your digital devices. It could be your TV or your smartphone. Well, these devices emit what's called blue light. And over time, blue light can actually suppress your melatonin production. That means it can affect your sleep. So what you can do is invest in some blue blocking glasses. I use these ones from BondCharge. They are the Morris blue blocking glasses. They block 100% of blue and green light. I just pop these on a few hours before sleep, and I find I have a better night's sleep. So if you'd like to try BondCharge's red light therapy devices or their blue blocking glasses, just head to bondcharge.com/5minutebody and use code 5MB to get a 15% discount. I just wanted to touch upon the reason why you can't say that it's going to prevent cancer, or nobody can say prevent. Can you talk about the idea of producing a high quality study and how long that takes? And that's the key why you can't say prevent, because I don't want people to think, well, I can't do anything about it. What is the point? There is a point. There is a real way that this can help.
So thank you for pointing that out, because that's a very important part of science is we really think that it can be preventative. What we can't do is prove it to the same degree that we like to prove things in science, which is a randomized controlled trial. RCT is the strongest kind of evidence you can have. And in a randomized controlled trial, you take an experimental group and then a control group, and you change one variable, and then you see what the result is. So we can do that in a small scale, and that's what we did with our cancer studies, the breast cancer studies. We had a small group of women, only 20 initially in the study. And, you have your two groups and you feed one a ketogenic diet. Now, you actually have to feed them that diet. So you have to make the diet for them. You package it up in a commercial kitchen. They come in and they pick it up, and that's all they eat. And then the control group are not counseled and eat what they normally would eat, which is probably still a healthy diet. Most people that have chronic disease tend towards a healthier diet once they've been diagnosed. And then you look at the changes that occur. But these are people that already have the disease. And so you can measure the changes, and it's over a short period of time. So we measure them. The first intervention is 3 months, and then we measure them at 6 months, and then they're free living for another 6 months after that. So even 6 months is a relatively short period of time. But these are people that have the disease, so we can see changes in the disease. Are the tumors shrinking? Are the markers for cancer decreasing? And and you're trying to control for just one variable, which would be a ketogenic diet as opposed to a standard American diet, which abbreviates as SAD, which I think is kind of good. And so when you're doing that to show the efficacy once somebody has the disease, that's way easier than showing it's going to prevent you from getting it, because these chronic diseases don't develop overnight. Like if it was something, say for COVID, and they say, we have this new thing, if everybody takes it like a vaccine, not many people get COVID. Sure enough, the COVID numbers go way down. But if you're talking about preventing something that develops over decades, you have to control those two populations for decades. And then you have to account for genetic differences and other lifestyle differences. How much are they exercising? How much are they smoking? How much are they drinking? And everybody lies about all that stuff, right? So the strength of the study becomes very weak. And you would have to control it, you'd have to feed people a diet. Like you'd actually have to make it and feed them. So the cost of doing that for a randomized control stage 3 type trial, like a drug trial, you'd need thousands of people on either side, and you have to follow them for 30 years, and it would just cost literally billions of dollars. And nobody has the time, patience, or money to do any of that. So that's why I say we can't say conclusively. But if you can say that a ketogenic diet has dramatic effects on people with diabetes and reducing their blood sugar and reducing their body fat, has dramatic effects on people with cardiovascular disease markers, and as we're showing, some early preliminary studies has effects on people with cancer, reducing tumor size and reducing the markers for those tumors. Well, you could argue that if it's good at addressing the disease once you have it, then those factors should also be good at preventing you from getting it in the first place. So I call it the PDS, is rather than RCT, which is randomized controlled trial. PDS is just pretty darn sure. So we are pretty darn sure, and it is a criticism that you hear from people, because there's this huge ingrained notion that a healthy diet is low carb or low fat, high carb, and all that, which is wrong. It's just upside down. But a lot of people have vested interest in that because they base their whole careers on that model, which has now been disproven, I would argue. So they'll say things like, oh, well, you can't prove that it prevents disease. And I would have to say, as a scientist, you're absolutely right. I cannot prove that. But you also can't prove that what you're saying has had any effect, other than the fact we've done this grand experiment on hundreds of millions of people in the West, telling them to eat a low-fat, high-carb diet. And what do we have? Rampant cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, obesity is just going through the charts. And it starts at about the time when we started recommending people eat high-carb diets. So that's a non-randomized controlled trial on a huge population, but it's observational and it's correlational, but we can actually show the mechanism by which that high carbohydrate diet causes obesity, inflammation, and insulin resistance.
So in simple terms, it's highly, highly, highly likely that a ketogenic diet will help prevent cancer cells from growing and the formation to get it out of control. Highly probable, highly likely, although not proven by a high-quality randomized study. Sorry, people.
Yeah, I don't know if I'd put all the highlies yet. I mean, to be honest, we just don't know. But what we can say is that those three factors that we mentioned correlate very strongly with cancer growth, the insulin resistance, inflammation, and obesity. And we can show the mechanisms at the cellular level by which they promote that. So let me give you an example. If you think of like your body is a whole bunch of cells, a whole bunch of different independent little organisms. So you think of that like your garden, your back garden, and you've got all your plants and grass and trees and the things that you want to grow, and that's your healthy body. Well, in there, if you just leave it alone, you'll get weeds growing, and the weeds are kind of like the cancer cells. They're abnormal growths, and if you don't weed them out, then they'll just take over and you'll end up with a garden full of weeds instead of a garden full of grass and flowers. That's kind of the way cancer works. So what we have in our bodies is this amazing immune system, which through 3 or 4 different pathways is capable of identifying cancer cells when they're small, or when the tumor itself is small and hasn't caused any problems yet. and destroy it and destroy those cells, those abnormal. They're part of our body, but they're abnormal cells. So it's like a weed eater. It's going through and weed eating. And so what you have is a balancing act. It's kind of an arms race, if you like. So on this side, you've got the cancer cells trying to grow and reproduce because that's what they do. That's why they're not good for us. And on the other side, you got your immune system that's trying to find those cancer cells and destroy them. So when we're young and our immune systems are healthy, it's very much tipped in favor of the immune system finding those and getting rid of them. As we get older, everything seems to slow down and your immune system slows down, which is why, we want to give vaccines to older people first and so on, because the immune surveillance isn't as vigilant as it was when they were younger. So that arms race is starting to tip in favor of the cancer cells being able to grow big enough to start spreading. And that's why you see more cancers in older people, because the immune system just isn't able to find it soon enough. So what we think is that by changing your lifestyle, which includes a ketogenic diet, includes exercising, stress management, and so on, we're rebalancing that. We're tipping it back in favor of your immune system. So when you were saying, we have to go back to the beginning, when you're saying it will prevent you from getting cancer, we get cancer all the time. We get cancer, several times a day, and it's a matter of our immune system being able to do that. So what we've seen in part of our studies, when we looked at the immunohistochemistry, which is the actual language that the immune cells are using to talk to one another, is an increase in the cell signals that are anti-cancer signals that are going to promote the development of cells that are going to find and destroy those cancer tumors. So we can see that tipping in favor of that. On the other side, if you think of what cancer cells need to grow, we mentioned the fact that they're anaerobic, so they need glucose. So glucose is sugar. And where does sugar come from? Carbohydrates. So you tell people, you should eat a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. Where are you going? Well, the cancer cells love that because now you're loading the body up with way more carbohydrate than we would normally get because we didn't evolve on, nor are we adapted for a high-carb diet. That's completely artificial, and it was completely wrong when they suggested it. We're actually evolved and developed for a high-fat diet. And if you look at Inuit and other indigenous peoples, Inuit can have 70 to 90% of the calories from saturated fat and on that diet, virtually no chronic disease, and they live to a ripe old age. So what happens is not only when you raise your blood sugar, but with this high-carb diet, you have to get that sugar out of your blood because high sugar in your blood is effectively what diabetes is. And that high sugar does all kinds of damage, causes inflammation. And so you release a lot of insulin. And when you release a lot of insulin, two things happen is that's a big growth factor. So the cancer cells are going, oh, great. Now you've given us tons of fuel to grow. And now you've given us tons of fertilizer to grow too. Thank you very much. And so the high sugar levels and the high insulin levels cause that accelerate the development of those tumors. That's the theory. And the other thing that happens when you have high insulin levels and you have sugar in your blood is that sugar won't go into the muscle cells to be burned. It'll go into your fat and you'll get fatter. So that's sort of a simple view of the mechanism by which a high carb diet causes obesity because it raises insulin levels and that biases the sugar to go into the fat and be stored as fat rather than going into the muscles and being burned. And secondly, in terms of cancer, you're increasing the fuel and the fertilizer that cancer cells need to grow. So the basic principle of the ketogenic diet then is to reverse that, is to say, well, let's take carbohydrate out of the diet altogether. And then that will moderate the blood sugar levels. You'll make your own blood sugar as needed. And that will moderate the insulin levels. So now you have lower levels of the fertilizer, lower levels of the fuel, and you're also enhancing the immune system to be able to detect those cells. So you're helping to tip that balance back in terms of you winning rather than the cancer winning. And that's the basic principle behind the study that we did is investigating whether that works or not.
Not so basic, but it makes sense. We're going to talk more about the scientific mechanisms by how the ketogenic diet works, because I think if people can understand Why is it that fat and saturated fat is so anti-inflammatory to so many chronic diseases, including cancer? That's very important to understand. But just to backtrack a second, talking about sugar, because sugar really does feed cancer cells. Cancer cells feed 100 to 200 times on sugar and glucose in the body. That's very important to understand. But people need to understand what is sugar. A lot of people that watch this podcast might probably think, yes, stay away from the donuts, bread, pasta. We know that, we know that. But fruit. I saw a study, which I don't know if it was a high quality study, but it was talking about the use of kiwis as a preventative measure to help prevent kind of help with cancer. And they were talking about the ascorbic acid, which is vitamin C, as an antioxidant. Do you have any information about that or any thoughts about that?
Probably not vitamin C. I mean, we've done some studies on omega-3 fatty acid, and to show that that one has some good qualities in preventing cancer in mice. That comes from the research we've done at the Terry Fox Lab at the BC Cancer Research Center. Dr. Gerald Crystal, I worked with him on that. Well, he did the work, but he's the one I partnered with on this other project. And yeah, so there are some foods. I think when you talk about fruit, because people go, well, fruit's got to be good for you, right? Well, sure, I guess. I mean, it depends what you're eating, but the fruit we eat is, I'm going to say, genetically modified. Now, not necessarily chromosomally modified, but through selective breeding and so on. The fruit we eat is loaded with sugar. The apples we eat, like Honeycrisp, it's a super sweet. Everything's super sweet. Or you have the sort of starchy sweet ones like bananas, which are, so if you eat a raw, green banana, it won't taste very sweet, right? But if you let it go yellow, it'll taste sweet. And if you let it get old, it gets even sweeter. So what's happening is the starch in there, which is the plant storage form of glucose, is breaking down as it ages and turning into glucose. Same thing with a carrot. Take a raw carrot and a cooked carrot and it'll taste sweeter. So when we talk about sugar, what we have to realize is starch is sugar in a different form. So that bread, pasta, rice, potatoes is all sugar when it gets into your blood. When it gets digested and absorbed through the wall of your gut into your blood, it goes in there as sugar. Blood sugar is called glucose. Now then there's table sugar, which is a disaccharide. So it's got a glucose and this other molecule called fructose in there. And fructose is really like from fruit. And the fructose is really sweet. It's sweeter than glucose, so we like it. And so, but we can't metabolize it very well. We don't metabolize it in our cells other than in our liver. And when we metabolize it to make it to be able to use the carbon and hydrogen as fuels and so on, it causes a lot of problems: increase in uric acid, increase in inflammation, increase in insulin resistance, and so on. So fructose is unhealthy, period. It's a known hepatotoxin. And so when you consider that, the average American in all the foods they eat is consuming something like a pound of sugar every week or so, and half of that is fructose, which is a known hepatotoxin. And then you say, well, maybe you shouldn't eat sugar. Maybe you should try monk fruit or something. Oh, I don't want chemicals. I go, what do you think the sugar is? The sugar is it's all chemicals. But you're eating, half of what you're eating is a known hepatotoxin, and all of it is raising your blood sugar levels. Now, the other thing that happens long-term when you eat that sugar, which comes from carbohydrate, are different forms of sugar. So the simple sugars, monosaccharides like glucose, disaccharides like fructose, those taste sweet. And then the larger, more complex polysaccharides or complex carbohydrates, these are the starches that you see in potatoes, rice, and so on, the plant starches. Animal starch is called glycogen. We store that in our liver. And so when that gets digested, it's all absorbed into the gut as simple sugars. And then those simple sugars raise the blood sugar level, and that triggers something over time called advanced glycated entities. So the glycated, the GLY, is the same as glucose, or that's where glycogen comes from. Glycated means there's sugars on it. So what happens is this high sugar level in your blood all the time, because people just pound sugar and carbs all day long, right? They have what do they have for breakfast? They have toast and cereal and sugar-laden yogurt and fruit that's loaded with sugar and orange juice, which is Coca-Cola with orange flavoring. And it's just a huge sugar bomb, which again creates that insulin rush, which then causes it to be deposited as fat. But when the sugar's in the blood, it creates these advanced glycated entities, which is when the sugars, the excess sugars, start attaching themselves in particular to proteins throughout the body. And once they stick pretty good, almost like glue. And when they stick, they activate macrophages, which are one of the body's main arbiters of inflammation. So that's how you get systemic inflammation from eating too much sugar, is these advanced glycated entities, which collect over time, just become more and more and more inflammatory. So the other thing that causes that systemic inflammation, which we can talk about later, are seed oils. So I think they should be avoided too. Generally, fats are good, but some fats are better than others. And the ones you want to avoid are seed oils, especially like cottonseed oil, linseed oil. And where do you see those is in fast food, because they're really cheap. And so don't eat any fast food. But if you have something like, that's fried in lard, which is, pig fat, totally fine. Like that's not going to cause you a problem. Despite what you've heard for the last 40 years, those are actually good fats that your body is used to metabolizing and can metabolize without causing any inflammation or anything like that. And it's a saturated fat. And it doesn't, I can tell you, the first thing I did about 15, 20 years ago when I switched into nutrition science was I tried to look for how saturated fats cause heart disease, because everybody knows that, right? Saturated fat, that's what we hear all the time. Saturated fats cause heart disease. So I was saying, okay, there must be a mechanism there, because a saturated fat has the fewest number of double bonds in it. It's basically just carbon and hydrogen. So I look at it and I go, that's like high octane gas. It's like the cleanest fuel you can put in your body. It doesn't have any of these troublesome double bonds in it that create problems. The length of the chain creates differences in the way it's metabolized, but in general, it's just pure carbon and hydrogen. So how could that be a problem, especially since we certainly evolved on a high-fat diet, as in evolutionary times millions of years ago, as the human species evolved. And so I looked for years. I looked at all the research, and there was nothing. It was all correlational. And it correlates, of course, with other lifestyle factors like smoking and sedentary behavior and alcohol abuse. But if you actually tease it all out and you look at the relationship between saturated fat and cardiovascular disease, it's a wash. It's not good for you. It's not bad for you. It doesn't do anything to promote cardiovascular disease. Sugar absolutely promotes cardiovascular disease because it causes that inflammation, the advanced glycated entities. It causes insulin. We should talk about insulin resistance when you're ready too, because that's a sort of process that develops over time. But sugar causes all those problems: inflammation, obesity, and insulin resistance. And there you go. So if you're looking for the culprit in your diet, and just the other day, I was talking about these. They're called chicharron, which is Mexican. It's the pork skin that's fried in lard, and that's like my snack food. And this fellow was saying, wouldn't that give you heart disease, right? And I go, why? How does that happen? I don't know. It just does, doesn't it? Like everybody knows that, and that's the problem. Is we've had our policymakers telling us that lie, that mistruth, for 40 years, and people just refuse to not believe it because they can't believe that it can't be true. So I've gone all over the world, as you have with your show now, talking to academics and so on, say, somebody tell me how a saturated fat causes the inflammation that causes heart disease. And it just doesn't. There is no mechanism because it doesn't exist. So sugar, absolutely.
Absolutely. So it's a very simple answer in terms of don't have sugar. And when you said don't have fast food, people should not have fast food. Many people do have fast food, but we can make better options. It's all about trying to make better options, lowering the sugar. We don't have to have carbs at zero, but we're going to talk about now the best way that we can help prevent cancer, if you want to say prevent, in a way that is adjunct to the standard care of therapy and other lifestyle measures. So it's not just diet alone. You have to do the other things. It's a ketogenic diet. Is it right to say that if you change the way that you eat, it's going to help 90% of the way to not get cancer cells and not get inflammation?
Well, let me, in general, yes, I agree with you, of course. but that's my area of research. So I do have that bias, and but I didn't come in. I came in with the opposite bias. I've taught health for 40 years, and for the first 30 of those years, I taught people low fat, high carb diet. That's the way you want to go. So the first thing I do in my book, Bio Diet, which I have here, is I just apologize to all those decades of students that I told a mistruth to, and I didn't do good science because I never looked for that primary research that demonstrated that saturated fats are bad for you. So that was the first thing I had to do, is apologize for that. So if you look at, there's a study done by, it was published, I think, in Lancet in 2017 on the global cause of chronic disease. And these are lifestyle factors. And so it turns out that of all the different lifestyle factors that relate to chronic disease, which is smoking, drinking, drug abuse, sedentary behavior, lack of exercise, which are different things, nutrition, stress, and so on and so forth. Nutrition is the most important lifestyle factor in terms of your likelihood of developing chronic disease. And it is so much so that it's more than all of those other factors combined. So on a global scale, not on an individual scale. So obviously if you smoke, that's dumb, don't smoke. But, and so that's the first thing is and if we look at obesity, we have a rule, generally weight management is about 80% what you eat and only about 20% what you do. And I'm glad that you identified those three things, because if we could just get people to eat less sugar, to not eat processed food, and ultra processed food, that junk in cartons that's not even really food. I mean, it's edible, but it's not really food in the sense. And get rid of seed oils. If we could just do that, just get people back eating grass-fed butter and buying and making and eating normal food, and getting sugar out of their diet, which includes a lot of the fruit. I still eat berries and so on, but just a handful a day. We could probably reduce the incidence of chronic disease by about 70% across the board. And think of what the savings there for our healthcare communities, all those people that are hospitalized for diabetes, cancer, cardiovascular disease. If we could reduce the incidence of that dramatically, there's no drugs that do that, but there is a simple lifestyle change. And I say simple. It's not simple in the sense that in the easiest way to describe a ketogenic diet is very low carbohydrate. So you get your carbohydrate level to the point low enough, which is usually around 5% of your total caloric intake. And then what will happen is you're not ingesting enough glucose to satisfy your body's needs. So your body will step in, which it is designed to do, and make it by itself. And it makes it from non-carbohydrate sources. So that process is called gluconeogenesis, which is glucose, neo, and genesis, like Bible creation. So creation of new glucose. And it comes from non-carbohydrate sources. So mostly amino acids from proteins and the glycerol from fats. And we're designed to do that. That's what cats and dogs do all the time. They're not eating salads 3 times a day or, eating a lot of carbs. They're eating meat. And we can do that too. We can, people on carnivore diets can survive just fine because they make their own glucose naturally. And so that's, and when you metabolize the fats, because you don't have as much carbohydrate to metabolize, so your muscle cells and other cells now switch from burning sugar to burning fat. Not only does it take the fat off your body, and typically, on a ketogenic diet, once adapted, people lose, women 10 to 15 pounds within about 3 months, and men 20 to 25 pounds of fat. They'll lose that because they're metabolizing that fat, because they're not eating sugar all the time, so their body switches to burning fat. And when they burn fat, there's a byproduct produced, which is called a ketone. And one ketone, there's actually ketone bodies, but the one ketone we produce is called acetoacetate, and then a small amount of that is converted into acetone, which you just breathe off. And then most of it is converted into something called Beta-Hydroxybutyrate, or BHB, which is a super beneficial health promoting signaling molecule. It's an energetic molecule. Your brain prefers it to glucose. Your brain will selectively burn BHB before it burns glucose. And it has all these super benefits in your mitochondria as well. So your mitochondrial health improves. So the ketones themselves are beneficial, on top of the fact that you're no longer creating that inflammation from eating too much sugar and seed oils and so on, and you're keeping your insulin levels moderate, and you're reducing your obesity. So we do know for sure, Rena, like randomized controlled trials, lots of them, that a ketogenic diet is very effective in treating diabetes. About 2/3 of type 2 diabetics can completely reverse their diabetes going out 5 years by just maintaining a ketogenic diet. In other words, they don't have to take any, insulin or anything like that. And it's very good at reversing the markers for cardiovascular disease, the most important of which is probably something called high sensitivity C-reactive protein, which is a marker of your systemic inflammation. That's really moderated. Your triglycerides in your blood go way down. Your HDL goes way up, which is the good cholesterol. This is very consistent. People's blood pressure drops. So we see that in cardiovascular disease. And then in cancer, we've seen too, this change in the biomarkers, which indicates that in the cytokines, the chemokines, an anti-cancer response, but also in some imaging we've done with PET-CT scans to show actually reduction of tumors in people with stage 4 metastatic cancer. So this is terminal cancer, but we've actually seen them be able to turn that around and start to reduce the size of the tumors and so on. So it seems to be addressing, because it addresses those 3 factors that are at the root of chronic disease so effectively, then you end up with a better health outcome overall. And that's why, PDS, pretty darn sure it's going to help prevent chronic disease from starting in the first place.
I love that you say pretty darn sure. It's very, I guess, politically correct, but it's a safe way to say it because we're not 100% sure. But it's interesting to understand that cancer cells, they actually have insulin and IGF-1 receptors, so that if you increase your insulin levels through sugar and carbohydrates, you are thereby increasing the formation and the growth of active cancer cells, and then promoting even cancer cells to grow. So the idea of a ketogenic diet, as low carb as you can, less than around 5% of your total calories. I wanted to focus on beta-hydroxybutyrate, because if we understand the science behind that, because it has different mechanisms in the body, if I'm correct, pertaining to mTOR, so it down-regulates mTOR. Can you discuss mTOR, what it is, and how, if that is increased, how that can lead to cancer and other inflammatory diseases?
Okay, so mTOR, which is the mammalian target of rapamycin, that's what the acronym is for. Again, if your listeners want to Google it, you'll see it has about 200 different metabolic changes so it's a huge black hole of changes, mostly directed towards increasing growth. So mTOR is not bad. It's just like insulin's not bad. Insulin is important. You need it. If you don't have insulin, you die. Too much insulin is not a good thing. mTOR is a good thing. It promotes growth and regeneration, repair of tissues, growth when we're younger, and so on. But too much of it, and you start enhancing the growth of things you don't want to grow, like cancer cells. So what you want to do is moderate mTOR. And yes, you're quite right and very good question, by the way, very, very knowledgeable question. The mTOR pathway is moderated by beta-hydroxybutyrate within the cell. And what is also changed in the cell is an upregulation of something called AMPK. And AMPK is kind of the benefit you get from exercise. It increases AMPK, which has all these positive effects on the mitochondria within the cell and on the body. So Peter Attia has his book out now too. He's a big fan of AMPK. He's studied that quite a bit. So in a way, the ketones from a ketogenic diet give you the benefits of the exercise, increased AMPK, and the reduced incidence of all chronic disease as a result, including cancer. And then the other one is HDAC, is histone deacetylase, which is how anti-cancer genes can be expressed and so on. And it's quite complicated because it has to do with the winding and unwinding of chromosomes when the genes are expressed. But in short, the HDAC, or histone deacetylase, HDAC, that is also diminished, which means that you allow the expression of the anti-cancer proteins that are produced in the cell. So that's, I think, what you were getting at when you're saying that these ketones can actually help prevent the development of cancer cells in the first place because of this HDAC inhibition.
I just wanted to clarify that because I think people understand that they want to increase their ketones for the anti-inflammatory effects. Another way that you can do that is through fasting. We're going to talk a bit about fasting and its effects on cancer prevention or to help with cancer. But it's important to understand the mechanisms behind how that works in terms of the beta-hydroxybutyrate. Let's move on to fasting. Autophagy and mitophagy, along with a ketogenic diet, how does that help with cancer?
So the principle of intermittent fasting is you just don't eat, right? So by not eating, your cells have to become more efficient and your body's more efficient. So cells that are sort of old and tired get consumed. The autophage means you eat your cells. So the white blood cells and so on come and get rid of the cells that you don't need anymore that are kind of getting old and so on. And these are really just epithelial cells because muscle cells and nerve cells don't reproduce. So but I would argue more important than that, and autophagy happens all the time, whether you fast or not. There is a theory that fasting increases the rate of autophagy. But what's more important is mitophagy, which is the turnover of mitochondria. Mitochondria actually reproduce pretty much on their own within your cells. So they're like little organisms in and of themselves. So you want to increase mitophagy. I mentioned exercise is the best way we know to increase mitophagy as well. Intermittent fasting does that to some degree. So there's different types of intermittent fasting. So to answer your question, the best way to practice intermittent fasting on a daily basis is to narrow your eating window to within about 8 hours. So from the time you start eating till the time you stop, you then have 16 hours that you're not eating. And that will stimulate autophagy and mitophagy and so on. And then there's some people that fast 1 day a week. And that may have additional benefit. I've never really seen the science that would indicate that's necessarily more beneficial, but it could. I'm not saying it can't. And the problem with that is you're actually not eating. That's the whole point. And when you're not eating, you're not getting any nutrition. So your body then has to digest itself to get the nutrition it needs. And it's, on a daily basis, that's pretty good. But I would never fast more than 2 or 3 days because then you start triggering these genes. There's so-called thrifty gene theory that genes are triggered that will actually cause you to put on more fat when you start eating again. And that's the problem. These 600-pound diet things on TV and so on, they lose a whole bunch of weight. They've all gained it all back and more because they've gone on calorie-restricted diet. So one of the great things about a ketogenic diet is it is not calorie-restricted. And I just wrote an article for a magazine about the fact we've got calories all wrong too. Calories are a unit of energy. They're not a unit of mass. So if you look at it that way and you need 2,000 calories a day, you should actually eat the most calorie dense food you can, which is fats, because it's about twice as dense as proteins or carbohydrates. So the notion that you shouldn't eat fats because they're dense in energy is exactly wrong, 100% wrong. And so that's the problem is you're not getting any nutrition when you're fasting, and I believe in nutrition. So if you look at the amount of all the micronutrients as well as macronutrients, but all the vitamins, minerals, and so on, microminerals that you need, it's really hard to get any of that if you're not eating at all. So I like the 8-16 kind of intermittent fasting. And then it's just a personal basis. I mean, everything about nutrition needs to ultimately be personalized, and you see how your body responds. So, when I started this diet more than a decade ago, about 12 years, actually more than 12 years ago, I was about 30 pounds heavier. So I was about 177, and this morning I was 146.8. So, and I've been that way because I stay on a ketogenic diet. So there's no real reason for me to intermittent fast, because I think that the benefits that you get from intermittent fasting, you would get on a ketogenic diet anyway. The transfer to fat metabolism and the production of ketones and so on, and also the acceleration of mitophagy and autophagy all happens with a ketogenic diet anyway.
Okay, just personally, because you follow a ketogenic diet, pertaining to your mum, do you think that she could have in any way prevented her breast cancer if she used these lifestyle and dietary measures at all?
I'm going to say no, because she was very young. She was in her 30s when she was diagnosed, and it would be what we now call triple negative. We didn't know what that was at the time, but it was a very aggressive form of cancer. I mean, children get cancers too. That's not really lifestyle factors. So I would say in my mother's case, it was almost certainly a genetic thing. The treatments would be better now for sure, but preventative, I don't think so. She also came from a mining town, Timmins, Ontario. So who knows about all those mine tailings that the kids were playing around on and that sort of thing. So I don't think though that would have helped her. But if her voice is in my ear now, she always, interesting you asked about my mother, because if she saw an obese person when I was young, she wouldn't say, oh, they're eating too much fat. She would say they're eating too many potatoes. That's why they're fat. They're eating too many potatoes. So, we knew even in days past that it was bread and potatoes that was making people fat. It wasn't eating fat. And people ate a lot more, organically, what we call organically produced proteins. And we probably evolved more on fish as well. So fish is great. But if you looked at my diet, Rena, if you looked at what I ate, it would look pretty much like what most people eat. There's just no rice, potatoes, or beans, or root vegetables on the plate. That's all. And I don't eat bacon and eggs every morning, although I did this morning. And I don't eat just meat. I'm not a carnivore. I eat lots of vegetables and a handful of fruit, lots of nuts. I do some baking, some keto baking, that sort of thing. So I have a very, very well-balanced diet. It's another myth about ketogenic diets is that they don't have fiber and they don't provide full nutrition. The term we use in clinically is a well-formulated ketogenic diet, which was coined by Stephen Phinney. And that means you're getting full nutrition. You're getting all the nutrients you need, all the calories you need. And if you think about it, what's in carbohydrate, it's just glucose. And then they add in stuff like starch, or they add in, salt and sugar and those sorts of things to flavor it. But if you just eat, carbohydrate like starch on its own just tastes kind of like cardboard. It has no flavor to it. The flavor is all in the fat.
That's what I say to people. I say that if people eat bread or pasta, it's really the butter and all the other fat that you put into it that tastes nice. But in your book, Bio Diet, it explains very simply how we can formulate a ketogenic diet. Because I think people think diets and they just don't know which one to follow. But if you understand principles, if people can understand principles, they'll know what foods or what lifestyle measures they have to follow to prevent cancer and all these inflammatory diseases, as well as obesity. I think most people just want to lose weight. So I'm going to leave the link for Bio Diet, Dr. Harper's book, in the show notes of this episode. Last question for you pertaining to environmental toxins, because we know that 90% comes from what you eat, but we can't negate the effects of our world, where we live. What are the main environmental toxins that we should be aware of?
Oh boy, like background radiation for starters, being a cancer involved in cancer research, radon, there's detectors for that because radiation is absolutely damaging to cells. UV light is a form of radiation. So, slap, slip, slop. What's the Australian one? Isn't it slap, slip, slip, slop, slap, right? To protect your skin. The good thing about skin cancers are, if there's a good thing, is you can see them because they're on your skin. So you see them before they cause too much trouble and you can address them. But yeah, the other environmental toxins, obviously smoking and things involved in that. There's some fertilizers that are used that have been related to a lot of cellular damage. And so, I tend to buy organic when I can. If it tends to be more expensive if it is truly organic, and I tend to try and buy 100 Mile, but I live in a place where there's lots of great farm food around here. So just don't eat processed food because there's all kinds of things in there. So I would say processed food contains a lot of stuff. Obviously smoking, surprisingly, just air pollution has a huge relationship, but that's not something we can necessarily do about as a person, although you can limit your exercise outside if there's forest fires going on like there are around you and around me right now. But all of that is improved if your overall health is improved. So think of it kind of like if you're a hardy person emotionally and you have to deal with some stress, you're going to deal with it better. So if you're a hardy person metabolically, if you're in good metabolic health, then you're going to be able to deal with those environmental toxins better. That's just a fact. And so what, when I signed my book, I signed, health and happiness. And by the way, if people want to know, they can go to the websites, biodiet.org, biodiet, all one word.org. There's some links there and resources with like a shopping list and that sort of thing. It's not a recipe book. The first half tells you what I've been talking about today, which is how a ketogenic diet makes you healthy. The second part is sort of a step-by-step process by which people can safely adopt a ketogenic diet, the same process we use in the clinic. But it's good food. It's good, tasty food. I'm a foodie. I love food. And so you don't have to give up food. You just have to give up sweets. And then you can substitute if you want. So I think that's a good point to make. But ultimately, as with anything, the better overall metabolic health you're in, the better you're going to be. And about 3/4 to 4/5 of North Americans are not in good metabolic health. So most people are not in good metabolic health. And so the best way to get in better metabolic health is to exercise, of course, but better overall is a ketogenic diet. The ketogenic diet is the number one way that you can improve your metabolic health.
What do you think about sunscreen and people want to slip, stop, slap? The chemicals in sunscreen, does that have any effect on inflammatory markers at all?
Yeah, well, there's some they banned now, right? Because initially, I think PABA is one they don't want to use. So here's a little trick there is, there's the sun protection factor. So people just think more is better. But it's actually doesn't work that way. There's a law of diminishing returns. So after you get an SPF of about 30, going to 60 doesn't give you twice the amount of protection. It gives you about 2% more, but you have twice as much of those dangerous chemicals. So if you are going to expose your skin to the sun, I don't use anything more than an SPF 30, unless you want to put like zinc oxide, which is not going to cause any metabolic problems, but on your nose or whatever, if you're going to be out in the sun, working construction or something like that. But yeah, wear a hat. I'm going to go to the pool in a little bit, and so I'll have my hat and my shirt that I can put on when I get out of the pool. And I wear a cap in the pool so that my head's out of the water, it doesn't get sunburned. And the radiation levels are very high right now, so it's very easy to get a sunburn. Of course, sunburns relate to skin cancers, and the one you really don't want to get is melanoma, of course, which is that's that OMA again. That's the one can be metastatic and cause all skin cancers can be problematic, but that one's quite more aggressive.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Harper, thank you so much for your time. This has been an encyclopedia on what cancer is, how it grows, and the effect of a ketogenic diet, which everyone can do to not only help with cancer, but all other inflammatory markers and chronic diseases. Dr. Harper, thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much for your time. And I'm sure we're going to see you very soon.
Yeah, well, I have to thank you too. I mean, doing shows like this is so important because all I really want to do is, I'm at the end of my academic career, but I just want to get the right information out to the general public. And so people that are providing the sort of service that you do to the general public to try, nobody does what you do unless they're leading from their heart. And so you genuinely want people. I signed my books, Health and Happiness. I'm sure that's what you wish for all your listeners. I just want to thank you for doing this show and for having me on. I look forward to talking again anytime to share with your listeners what I've learned over 40 years about health and happiness and how good nutrition can help prevent and treat chronic disease. So thank you very much, Rena. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for joining me on this episode with Dr. David Harper. You can find the full show notes, including books, free resources, and reference articles in the 5MB Labs. There is a link in the description down below. If you're learning from and enjoying these episodes, please hit the subscribe button. That is an excellent zero-cost way to support this free health podcast. If you have a question for me or a recommendation of a guest speaker, please leave that in the YouTube comments as I check every single one. You can also find me on other social media accounts. I'm on Instagram and on X, formerly known as Twitter, as I generally share different information to what you'll see here on YouTube. I share health tips and advice that I hear from the best experts. And finally, if you enjoy this episode, you'll also enjoy another episode I did with Dr. Nathan Bryan. Dr. Bryan is an expert in nitric oxide, and that is a naturally occurring molecule that occurs in the body. It is responsible for vasodilation, which is the widening of your blood vessels. And it's been shown that nitric oxide can reverse chronic disease like Alzheimer's, dementia, heart disease, and even diabetes. Dr. Nathan Bryan will discuss the two main mechanisms by which nitric oxide is produced in the body, but most importantly, why we lose nitric oxide as we age, and 6 ways to naturally increase nitric oxide. Dr. Bryan will also talk about medications that suppress nitric oxide, including antacids, statins, and a lot of over-the-counter medications that you'll need to know about. Finally, thank you for your interest in root cause healing, and I'll see you next week.